It's so great to be here. I think this is my third TechKnow conference, and I love it. I think the story that we have to tell at Argenica is an extremely compelling one, and I think one that really touches on not only the investment potential in what we're trying to do, but I think also the emotive side of what is neuroprotection and neurological injuries, which as Chrissy pointed out, I think probably at some point in our life does touch us all. So just a quick disclaimer. So I'm going to talk to you today about neuroprotection. Neuro being the brain, and then we all know what protection is. So our lead drug candidate, known as ARG-007, is essentially, it is a drug that is able to protect brain cells following injury. Our lead indication is ischemic stroke. This is a huge unmet need. So 1 in 4 people in this room will suffer a stroke in their lifetime. It is absolutely massive in terms of the unmet need and that opportunity that we're going after in stroke. So we are in a phase 2 clinical trial in that indication. The way that the drug works, it has multiple mechanisms of action, and I'll try and explain a little bit about the way that the drug works. But this multiple mechanism of action in neuroprotection actually then lends itself to a number of other neurological conditions. So we have data in traumatic brain injury, both severe TBI, so we're talking about traumatic brain injury suffered, say, post a motor vehicle accident, domestic violence, king hit, those types of severe TBIs. And we're also looking then to expand that into concussion, so really relevant in terms of sporting injuries. We are quite progressed in an indication known as hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. This is a newborn infant condition where it generally occurs when the cord is wrapped around the baby's neck during childbirth. And so you're blocking blood flow to the brain through the restriction of blood flow through the carotid arteries. And these poor children suffer horrendous neurological and functional deficits following this brain injury. But what I love about this company is the science that it is built on. So this drug has spun out of a research institute in Perth known as the Perrin Neuroscience Research Institute. That institute punches above its weight. It's already had 3 FDA-approved drugs that have come out of that institute. So we're hoping that this is the next drug out of that institute that will get regulatory approval. But it is based on a decade of work that's happened at that research institute. So we're now up to 26 peer-reviewed publications. So if you love science, if you've got a science or medical background and you want to dig into the science, we have huge amounts of data available that you can look at. But that puts us in good stead when we're actually talking to potential large pharma companies, because they can do a lot of work on not only how the drug works, but how effective it is and how safe it is. And we also now know we have data to show that the drug is safe in healthy volunteers. So just quickly looking at where we're sitting as a company. So we raised 12 million a couple of months ago. We raised that money at 52 cents. Share price went up to 98.5. So if you came into that placement, you've done very well in the company. We have drifted back down, but we are sitting at around 100 mil market cap. We listed the company 3 years ago in June 2021 at a 15 mil market cap. So we've generated significant value for shareholders to date, but there's so much value still in this company. That stroke market that we're going after just in the US is worth, just for the indication that we're looking at, where no one else is playing, is worth $5 billion a year minimum. No one is in that market. That is the market potential that we are looking at. We've also been really successful in attracting grants, so both federal government grants, WA state government grants as well. So that's close to $5 million of non-dilutive funding, and we'll continue to apply for those grants. So quickly just getting into stroke and what we're talking about here in terms of neuroprotection. So when someone has a stroke, they have a clot in a blood vessel in the brain. So that is the thing that causes a stroke, and obviously then the functional outcome of that patient is what we typically associate with stroke, so drooping face, paralysis on one side of the body. Brain cells last for about 3 seconds before they start dying once a clot is lodged in a blood vessel in the brain. And essentially what happens is you get an upregulation of a neurotransmitter known as glutamate. That glutamate starts flooding the space around the brain cells, and it causes all these little channels on the brain cells to open up, and calcium starts flooding into those brain cells and causes those brain cells almost to implode on themselves. Once one brain cell implodes, it releases more glutamate, and the cycle just keeps going. So you get this kind of cascading out of brain injury, and we can see that on the imaging in these stroke patients. So what our drug does is it blocks those little channels. It actually takes those little channels and pulls them into the cell so that there's no ability for that calcium to flood into those brain cells and cause that implosion. So we sort of think about it as actually hibernating the brain cells and essentially buying that patient time to get the treatment that they need. This is a bit of a technical graph, but what we do within our lab is we look at all of the competitor drugs, and there's actually not that many, there's only a handful. I can count them on one hand that are actually in the clinic looking at this exact problem. And what we know, we have the only drug globally in the clinic that blocks those calcium channels on brain cells. So we're the only company that is actually able to achieve this in the world. Every other company that's in the clinic is looking at things further down that brain injury pathway, so inflammation, edema, those sorts of things. But we know with our drug in our preclinical work that if you stop that calcium influx, you actually don't get all those other associated things. So we globally, we are the leading company addressing this problem, which is hugely exciting. So in terms of what we've done to date, so what the preclinical studies show in a model that really reflects the clinical setting in humans is that we're able to reduce brain injury by 70%, which is massive. So think about the functional outcomes of those patients. If they get 70% reduction in brain injury is huge. We know that the drug is safe to administer in ambulances. It doesn't exacerbate bleeding. We know that it can be given with standard of care drugs. So in drug development, that's hugely important. You cannot be developing a drug that may have an impact on another drug that's already used as standard of care. So the drug that's given to stroke patients is a drug that dissolves the clot. It's called a lysis drug or TPA. So we know that our drug doesn't have an impact on that drug, and nor does that drug have an impact on our drug. And as I mentioned, we have undertaken a phase 1 clinical trial, so we know that the drug is safe and well tolerated in humans. One of the things to point out, to get a neurology drug approved, the biggest hurdle that you do need to get over is safety. So unlike oncology, where you're actually developing a drug that you want to be toxic, in neurology, you need to prove that the drug does no harm. So this is the biggest hurdle that we need to get over. For a large unmet need like stroke, where there are no drugs on the market to protect brain cells, the hurdle around the efficacy, so how well that drug works to get that drug approved and on the market, is actually relatively low. So if you look at any of the recent approved Alzheimer's disease drugs, the efficacy is reasonably marginal, but the FDA wants to get these drugs on the market. They want people to start using them. They want to see then other drugs come into the market that actually can beat that efficacy. So the hurdle for efficacy isn't huge. What we're really focused on is safety. The drug can do no harm in stroke patients. So that leads me to our phase 2 clinical trial. So we have announced last week that we have dosed 20 patients in that trial. The youngest patient in that trial is 45. The average age of the patients is 70. So we're not talking about a really old person's condition here. We actually had a gentleman come in who was 32 into that trial. His parents decided not to consent into the trial, was absolutely fair enough, but we're not talking about an old person age-related condition here. So what we are doing in this trial, so when someone suffers a stroke and the paramedic arrives, the first thing is to get them to hospital as soon as possible. So you need that stroke diagnosed via imaging, and the only way that can be done is in hospital. So when the patient comes into hospital, we start screening them and looking, are they eligible potentially for our clinical trial? Once we have the scan and we know it's a clot sitting in a large vessel in the brain and that patient looks like they'll be eligible for our trial, then we will, not me, but the neurologist and the stroke care nurses will administer either our drug or a placebo in that trial. That patient will then go to a standard of care procedure known as a thrombectomy. So this is the mechanical removal of the clot. So a shunt is put up into the groin, all the way up into the brain, and a neurointerventional radiologist will aspirate, suck out that clot. That's a really key element of the clinical trial design that I probably don't have time to go into, but really what we're trying to do is also you get a secondary injury post that thrombectomy. That procedure is much better than leaving a large clot in your brain, but you do get this reperfusion or secondary injury. So we're hoping that our drug will also protect against that. But first and foremost, we are testing the safety of our drug in this trial. So we're looking at mortality rates, we're looking at if there's any adverse events. We need to prove that our drug does no harm to stroke patients. And then as a secondary endpoint, we are also looking at how well is the drug working at actually reducing that brain injury. So we'll look at that on imaging, either MRI or non-contrast CT. So in terms of the trial itself, we are activating 10 hospitals in Australia. We are only doing this trial in Australia. Australia is extremely well known globally for running these types of stroke trials, and the neurologists are absolutely world class. It is a double-blinded study. So that means that we don't know, no one knows except a couple of people, whether the patient is receiving a placebo, so a saline IV infusion, or our drug. That's really important in clinical trial design to keep it blinded so we don't introduce any potential biases into the study. And then we're looking at these acute ischemic stroke patients where they've got a clot in a large vessel in the brain. So these are the most severe types of stroke that result in the biggest types of brain injury. In terms of where we're sort of sitting at the moment, so we're recruiting 92 patients into this trial. We are now at 20. Those 20 have been recruited in only half of the hospitals that have been activated. So that's in 5 of the hospitals, and that's happened in 4 months. So we are well ahead of our recruitment target, which we had initially thought was the end of next year. But this time next year, we expect that we should have pretty much the majority of that dosing done. We now have 8 sites activated, and all 10 sites will be activated by the end of this week. The next real sort of milestone then is looking at 23 patients, which we're pretty close to. And throughout the trial, we're always looking at safety. So whilst it's blinded, we are just making sure that there's no particular patient that may potentially be having a safety issue that could be related to the drug. So I just want to quickly touch on, I'm adding an extra minute, yeah, is that okay? Okay. Quickly touch on the other indications. So the value of the company at the moment, that 100 mil market, all the value really does sit in that stroke indication. But we are progressing other indications, as I mentioned before, so TBI, HIE, and also Alzheimer's disease. The TBI data is starting to look really, really compelling. So again, there are no drugs, no therapeutic drugs on the market that can protect against brain injury in TBI. 69 million people globally suffer a TBI that warrants them going to hospital every year. So you think the $5 billion stroke market is big? The TBI therapeutic market is absolutely phenomenal. So we have got some really compelling data, not only in rats, but we actually moved into a more relevant model in ferrets. As you can see there, the brain of ferrets is a lot more realistic in terms of how it relates to humans. And what we look at in the TBI, so a lot of the injury actually happens in the hippocampus. So you get protein aggregation in the hippocampus, which can then lead to, later on in life, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. It's really the accumulation of proteins in this area. And so what the data shows us is that it's really working to reduce that protein aggregation in that key region of the brain back down to normal levels, which is phenomenal. So over the next 6 months, we'll be generating a lot more data in TBI and looking at options to take that into the clinic. I'll just quickly go forward in terms of, so HIE, this infant condition I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this is actually a rare paediatric condition. We've got, again, some really compelling data, and we're doing larger animal studies really just to de-risk the drug asset as much as we possibly can before we take this into the clinic. But what an orphan indication comes with is the potential to get a lot of incentives. So we have orphan drug designation and rare paediatric disease designation for HIE from the FDA. So it means we get 7 years market exclusivity, we get tax credits from the FDA, we get priority review of our clinical trials, and if we're successful, we will get a review voucher, priority review voucher, which we can sell to another company that is north of $100 million US. So that's what those vouchers are valued at. So really exciting near-term catalysts in the next 6 months. We've got a lot going on, so keep an eye out for our trial results and our preclinical data. Thank you.